Hi, welcome. I'm Paul Cargan, and I'm here with David Mura, author of 10 books, if I counted correctly, of poetry, fiction, memoir, craft criticism, including most recently A Stranger's Journey, Race, Identity, and Narrative Craft in Writing, which David has agreed to talk with me about today. You teach at a number of places, including VONA, the preeminent workshop in the U.S. for writers of color. So, David, thank you for talking with me.
Well, thank you for having me.
Let's just jump right in. In your discussion of narrative craft, in A Stranger's Journey, in some chapters towards the end, the four questions of the narrator, four questions concerning the narrator. You apply it to fiction, and then in the following chapter to memoir, you make a point about craft that I had never thought of, which is that even when the narrator is not an overt character in the story, the writer still needs to be clear with themselves and maybe in the text who is speaking, who the narrative voice is, who they're talking to, and when and why. And I thought, even though this is not a narrative per se, let's start with that. Who is the narrative voice in this book? Who are you talking to, and why?
Well, that's a good question. On one level, there are parts of the book which is just addressed to writers in general who are interested in writing fiction or memoir. So there are things about craft, about, say, how you structure a story in fiction or how you discover story in a memoir, which are just tools for all writers. And then there is a portion of the book which focuses on the issues of race and identity, and how I argue that these are now central elements of the craft of writing now, that people need and should examine, whether you are a white writer or a writer of color or indigenous writer. Now, I think the thing is that most writers of color and indigenous writers understand that they have to both present and articulate their own identities to their readers, and that identity involves the categories of ethnicity and race. The thing is, when white writers begin to address these issues, oftentimes they don't address these issues because they don't think that their being white is really a subject of investigation, which on one level I find astonishing, and another level it is sort of expected, because in this society it is people of color who have a racial identity, and whiteness is seen in many ways as a universal and therefore neutral default. And so part of it comes out of so I'm in that section of the book, I feel like I'm trying to address two groups of readers at once, because in one of the essays, I go over the experience of a writer of color in a typical MFA program, and I delineate the experience of many of my students and colleagues, which they've talked to me about. So either what happens in these instances is there's a writer of color in a writing class. The white writers begin to bring in work which the writer of color feels either is plagued by stereotypes or two-dimensional portraits or one-dimensional portraits of characters of color. And when the writer of color begins to critique these, what happens then is actually a racial argument. But it's not really dealt with as a racial argument. Instead, it's dealt with this, what you're talking about is political, and it's outside the bounds of the writing class. A similar thing happens when a writer color may bring in something, and either people go, well, I'm just not interested in this, or or they begin to argue with the writer that really can't be their experience. Again, the argument then becomes an argument about racial issues, but the writer's the way the writer color frames these, they're both aesthetic and political. So my problem in an essay like that is, who am I writing to? You know, and part of the essay is to students of color who may have experienced this or are experiencing this. You know, after I published the essay first in the Kartika Review, I would get emails from students of color from around the country saying, exactly what you described in your article is happening to me now in my writing class or my MFA program. But at the same time, I'm presenting this, I'm also trying to convince white writers and white writing instructors that the argument that bringing up race is political is a shoddy argument. And you know, at one point I quote Richard Wright, and Richard Wright implied that Black and white America are engaged in a struggle over the description of reality. Well, Black and white America are engaged in a struggle with the description of reality. Why wouldn't that argument enter the classroom of creative writing, which is our attempt to describe our reality? And so how you can label that argument just aesthetic and political is very difficult. You know, another essay I talk about the common rule or practice of white writers not to identify their characters racially. So if the character is Bill or Bridget and there's no indication about what their race or ethnicity are, we're supposed to assume that they're white. And this assumes that whiteness is a universal default. It's also part and based in this idea that the majority of people are white people. So we don't, but it's also saying that white people don't have a racial identity, or that their racial identity is not important to who they are, the way they identify themselves, or even more importantly, their experience. Now, I say you can make this aesthetic argument that it's not that important, but you can't tell me that's not also a political argument. Because in actuality, it is much closer to a conservative political argument than it is to a liberal political argument, even though most writers consider themselves liberal. So, but what I would further argue is, no, that's not true. Like, you know, if we know that smoking marijuana occurs at equal rates in whites and blacks, and we know that black people are 4 times more likely to be arrested for smoking marijuana, okay, for the black person, their racial identity affects their experience with the police, and perhaps they're being arrested. But if you're white and you're 4 times less likely to be arrested, your whiteness is still affecting your life. You just don't see it. You don't consider it. So it's hard in those, sometimes in the essays, to figure out, for me, who I'm talking about. But part of it is I'm also trying to provide writers of color with arguments to present to their colleagues to defend their work or to critique mischaracterizations of people of color. And at the same time, I'm trying to get white writers and writing instructors to consider race differently than they may have previously.
This very same essay that you just referenced, the student of color in the typical MFA program, I think is the most powerful in the collection. It was just incredibly helpful for me. and I do have a couple questions about it. So you just summarize it. It's a description of the typical experience of something racist happens in the workshop, and then the student of color, that's the typical situation, is there. It's everybody's white, the teacher's white, and there are one or a few students of color. Then have to decide, do I challenge this? And if they decide to, then kind of all the white people in the room say, oh, it's not about race, it's not racist, you're overreacting. And so then the writer of color you describe has a choice. Do they persist and they get labeled a troublemaker? And you give some advice to writers of color that I think is just so helpful, and I'm so glad this essay is out there and being read, about how to survive and about choosing battles. But I want to ask you then about white creative writers or teachers of creative writing who might read this essay and say, I want to be different. Mm-hmm. So I guess on page 57, you say, very rarely in response to a challenge by a writer of color in the workshop, will the white professor and the other students kind of respond in a healthy, hopeful, constructive way. What would it look like if we did? If we as white writers and white teachers responded differently than what is typical?
Well, I think depending on where the person is, ideally, what the white instructor should do is go, okay, let's begin to unpack this. Let's look at the issues of stereotypes. Look at where these stereotypes come from. Let's critique, let's go on and critique other works. For instance, let's go read Toni Morrison's Playing in the Dark, which makes similar critiques of canonical white authors like Willa Cather, Hemingway, Faulkner, Twain, right? And because it will be easier then for the white writers to deal with these issues if it's not my work, where you're saying, because the writer of color would, I notice in your work, whenever people of color show up, they only show up as either criminals or threats, right? Now, of course, in the area of this, the individual white writer who's often, young developer is going to be defensive, right? And you sort of have to deal with this. But if you then say, look, at the mistakes you're making are mistakes that Hemingway made, that Faulkner made, that Cather made, right? And that they're really tied to a larger issue of how we are taught as white people to look at the society and people of color, right? Then it opens up an area of investigation. So, and what people need to realize is, in this classroom, it becomes an argument between one or two people of color and 10 or 15 white people, right? And that argument is looked at as an argument between individuals, which it is, but it's also an argument between groups about the description of reality. So if we move it to an argument about two different groups describing reality and the differences and contrasts in those descriptions, then we can remove it at least a little out of the realm of I'm attacking you, you're attacking me, to something which is a little less psychically threatening to people that people can begin to deal with. Because part of the thing is we're not used to as a society talking about these issues of race really honestly, and we're not prepared to deal with it, and people get so instantly defensive that's also what you have to be aware of in trying to deal with these issues.
In this same essay, which, I mean, just as a piece of writing is striking in how specific you are describing these very common practices and processes and what's behind them psychologically, kind of very specific to the creative writing classroom or workshop. But you say on 52 that what you describe in this essay, which is essentially something racist happens or something racially problematic or questionable, and then it's on, the onus is on one or a few people of color to say something about it, and then kind of the collective white denial asserts itself. You say that this process occurs everywhere in American society, in educational institutions and businesses and political institutions, in the justice system. And I thought that was really a helpful point, that we can take this and apply it. I wonder if you might elaborate on that point.
Well, let me give two examples. One is an employer in a company, employee comes up and says, I feel like the other employees are somehow treating me in a racially biased manner, right? Or creating a hostile workplace, right? The way that the institution deals with these arguments starts out on a personal level. It doesn't start out on a level of, we're really arguing about the description of reality, right? The interpretation of reality, the interpretation of incidents, right? But that's actually what they're dealing with. Now, when it becomes relationships, it becomes very hard to deal with. And those arguments really that ensue in that business or organization are not that different from the arguments that occur in a creative writing class. Let's use another example, which is slightly different. Somebody says, the way we practice medicine in our emergency room is racially biased, right? And the staff would go, no, how could that be? None of us are racist. We don't do this. Then they do a study, and it finds out that Black patients must wait longer for pain medication and receive less pain medication for the same conditions that white people. So in other words, if you're a Black person with a broken arm, you have to wait longer to receive pain medication, and you receive less pain medication than a white person with a broken arm. Now, this takes place in emergency rooms all throughout the country. It's a known health statistic. All right. If you initially make the charge, people go, well, that's just subjective. This doesn't really. But when they actually do the studies, they find objectively that this is true. And then you have to ask yourself, is it because everybody in the emergency room was a racist? But then it depends, how do we define racism? Right? There's clearly racial discrepancies in the administration of pain medication. And then what we understand is people can act in a racially biased manner and be unconscious, right? So unless you actually enter the idea that you can act in a racially biased manner without being conscious of it, you can't argue about these things, right? It's like, how did this happen? Because you can go through the whole emergency room and go, are you racially biased? And of course, even those who are racially biased are not going to say it. So how do you deal with this discrepancy? How do you talk about it? And it actually, in the end, is a very complicated issue, both on terms of individual relationships and psychology and the way we relate to each other and can we talk about it, but it's also embedded in the ways that we define racism. Because we define racism as just something is racist is something somebody consciously and openly declares an intent to be racist, right? But when South Dakota says you need a street address on your voter ID, And they go, well, this is just a bureaucratic thing. We need street addresses. And it happens that the only people in South Dakota who don't have street addresses are all the people on the Native American reservation. There's a racially biased intent, but nobody's owning up to that intent. So
yeah,
you can't discuss these issues without discussing the way racism works. And most, and a lot of white people don't really understand it, nor do they actually believe. It's also a system of belief, right? Because it's like, think about before, blacks and other people of color have been talking about police brutality and hostility for years. White people didn't believe them. They only began to believe them when the advent of cell phones or the Rodney King video 27 years ago, where they had video proof. So what does this say? It says white people don't believe inherently the testimony of people of color. So if that's the truth and I'm a writer of color, what am I dealing with when I enter a creative writing class?
I mean, that's all just very heavy. And I'm thinking about kind of white responses to this, right? So say in the ER room scenario you just described. So like the doctors and nurses and administrators who are white, like what is most important to them? Is it to make sure everybody knows they're not racist, or is it giving medicine to people of color on an equitable basis? And so I think in the writing classroom too, then that's like what matters here? Do you want to just make sure everybody knows you're not racist, or do you want to give this a hearing and fix some of these problems?
Yeah, I think that's the question, and we're not prepared psychologically to deal with this most places, because it takes a while to really talk honestly about these things, and it's a matter of trust, because most people of color don't tell white people how they honestly feel about race relations in America, because you just know it's not likely to change things around you, and much more likely to bring some sort of recrimination and punishment on you. So that's the dilemma of the writer of color within the workshop. It's like, do I really speak honestly and truthfully about what I think and feel? And then, like, if I begin to do this and I'm dependent upon the professor for a recommendation, right? Are they going to label me a troublemaker, somebody difficult to deal with, somebody who can't learn? One of the things I tell students of color is sometimes you do have to just be quiet, because you don't have the power to fight these things. Wait till you get your degree, get a book, get tenure, and then you have the power to actually make these arguments. But if you try to make these arguments against the whole MFA writing department, most likely you're going to lose. Now you can make that argument, and I applaud you if you do, but perhaps it might be wiser to just go through, get your degree, and then once you're in a more successful position of power, to fight the battle. Because I quote Sun Tzu in the book where I say, Sun Tzu says, "Don't fight battles you can't win."
And at one point in the book, and this is a different but related question, you quote the writer Garrett Hongo saying, "The show don't tell aesthetic is a white man's game." And this very specific point seems really important to me, because there's probably no adage in creative writing that's more predominant than show don't tell. And so it's kind of that one specific craft motto or adage probably stands in for a lot of them. But I'm hoping you can you help me unpack this, because on the surface, to me, and I think to a lot of people, the show don't tell seems race neutral. And so to hear him and you quoting him say it's a white man's game, help me understand that.
Okay, so come to read Hemingway and you don't understand them in an English class. People go, you have to understand this. So it's like I came and read, I didn't understand T.S. Eliot when I first read it. So what I did is I went back and read of all of Eliot's criticism. I read the footnotes. I read the things in the footnotes. I read criticism about Eliot. And I learned how Eliot looked at the world, what his literary references were, what his cultural references were. So I learned how to think and look at the world the way Eliot did. If you read Hemingway, we've all been, if you're a successful person of color, if you reach middle class, you understand, you have to understand how white heterosexual males look at the world. If you don't, you're really not going to be able to function within white middle class society. So Hemingway can then do the 1/10 of the iceberg above, and we all learn what the 9/10 below is, right? In contrast, I'm 8 years old. A name comes up in my family. I'm the 3rd generation Japanese American. Say Hank, right? And somebody asks, Nihonjin or Hakuji, which is Japanese or white person. And if they go Nihonjin, somebody would go, what camp were they in? And somebody would say Heart Mountain. Hank was in Heart Mountain camp. And then the conversation would go on. Well, nobody in my family talked about being interned during World War II. Nobody sat down and says, during World War II, 120,000 Japanese Americans were taken from their homes and put in desolate prisons in desolate places in the West, in deserts or mountainous regions, behind barbed wire, under rifle tower guard. And we were never formally charged with anything. We were never given a trial. And the effect of it on the community was this great silence and sense of shame. I had a friend, a Japanese American friend, who thought they were summer camps. And until she got, until late in high school or college, she read some history about it. So I could show that conversation, right? But even I didn't know growing up what it meant. Even I didn't know how the internment camps affected my parents in terms of the way they identified themselves ethnically and racially and how they reacted psychologically. And I had to figure out that the way they reacted psychologically was their race and ethnicity was a crime. So if you're arrested for your race and ethnicity to show you're reformed, the implicit message is to not show your race and ethnicity. And that's the way they raised me. So I wrote my memoirs to provide the sort of, and Garrett talks about this too. He said, Leung Lee, you and I were all writing memoirs to provide the cultural, historical, and political background to our poetry that is not there in the culture. But it was also, I think, for me to understand who I was, because the culture nor my family provided me with tools to understand what it meant to be a 3rd generation Japanese American.
That's incredibly helpful. So this is what I'm thinking then about then is it's the don't tell. It's not that there's a problem with showing, it's the problem with banning telling.
Yes.
The admonition don't tell works for white writers because we've all already been told about white culture, and it doesn't work. That's not the case for people of color because their cultures haven't been told and need to be told. Is that?
And their cultures are not universalized, right? So if you think of hip hop art, and also the other thing, they come out of different histories. Hip hop comes out of the history of signifying. And you have to go back and read Henry Louis Gates', The Signifying Monkey to understand what that means. But it's like black people had to learn how to talk to white people in ways that white people would assent to, and yet at the same time convey messages that white people couldn't understand. So some of black language is meant specifically to hide meanings from white people. Well, most of the time, white people didn't care, right? They didn't care. But if you're reading a piece of literature by a black person, and you go, well, I don't really care. I don't care that I don't understand this language, or I don't understand what exactly is going on in this book, or I don't really get any pleasure out of this poem of identity. That there's never the reaction of, maybe I don't understand how to read this. Maybe I don't have the proper cultural literary background to fully appreciate this art. And then how would I get that?
In kind of at the end of the first part of your book, you state kind of an argument you have been making up to there, that for someone to say, let's just focus on craft and leave politics out of here, is not, it's not sufficient. And here's the comment I wrote at the end of that chapter. I went to see if I'm on track here. So to the exclusion of politics from craft is white supremacy, or a form of it or related to it, because politics are crucial to the lives and writing of so many people of color, and to exclude that is to exclude them. Am I on track here? Am I understanding? Am I overstating that?
Yes. No, I don't think you're overstating it. What I would say is the corollary is the idea the white writers have is like writing should be outside the political. It is a political idea. It has a political effect in the world. It has an effect in the way, what is politics is about power. And power can be manifested in many different ways. Power can be, Foucault says power is not simply repression. It produces pleasures. It also produces what we find pleasurable, right? So if you find pleasurable all these works which exclude the experiences of people of color, well, how is that going to affect your dealings with people of color? When a person of color shows up in your room, in your office, you've already gone like, I'm not interested in people like you. Whew. Right? I don't read this. It's, and you could be, I use the example of, I don't name the person, but one of my friends said to one of his white friends who was like 45, gotten several degrees, won National Book Awards for poetry, and then never read Baldwin. He just decided, like, no, it wasn't, he knew Eastern European poets. He knew all the Latin American poets, but he never read Baldwin because he thought, like, I could become an educated person without knowing Baldwin. It's hard to find a black writer who doesn't think Baldwin is essential. You're already starting from a place of argument even before you start the conversation. And the white writer's ignorance of Baldwin has a political effect, because once you read Baldwin, you can't look at race in America the same way again.
I love Baldwin. And that, I guess, what you had said, or you quoted your friend as saying, if you don't read Baldwin to his friend, we can't be friends anymore.
Yeah.
And I thought that was powerful. One aspect of narrative craft that you discussed is lying, and specifically you talk about having to force the protagonist to lie into situations where they lie to themselves. And as an aside, that felt a little close to home in me looking back on my own life.
Mm.
But what I want to ask you about is a statement you make that's related to that on 164. You say, we as human beings almost always know the truth about ourselves and our relationship to the world, if we dig deep enough.
Yeah.
And I want to ask you about that, because my impulse would have been to assume the opposite of that, is that we're almost always deceived. So I wonder if you can talk about that a little more.
Well, I think we're dealing here with the difference between, I would say, two aspects of it. One is conscious knowledge and unconscious knowledge. In other words, there are things which our unconscious has kept secret from us, right? But it's still there within inside us. And what is creative writing? I argue the definition of creative writing is the search for and creation of a language to express what we know unconsciously, but don't yet have a language to express. So the other aspect of this is you need a language to express thoughts, realities that the language that you possess now can't. So
Oh, my camera has frozen up for a second.
In I taught language.
Hang on a second, David. You're cutting in and out. All right. Are you still there?
Are we?
Oh, you're back.
We're back. Okay, so let me. I'll just
cut out for a second. Oh, and it's frozen yet again. Right. See if we can get reconnected here. All right, I see a picture of you.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, I can hear you. Yep.
Can you see me? Yeah.
I can see. Yeah, there you are.
All right.
All right, you're back.
Okay, so the question about lies, and I think people unconsciously know when they're lying. They don't know it. But there's a difference between what we know unconsciously and unconsciously. The way this works in fiction narrative is a character pursues a goal, and in the pursuit of the goal, they may tell lies, right, in order to pursue the goal. And one of the things I say is we lie often when we face an irreconcilable conflict. The easy one is, I want to remain married. I want to have an affair, right? So lies ensue. And we know, and there's two parts of that lie. One is the lie of the denial of reality. It's like, I can remain happily married and have an affair. That's possible. Or I can become a law partner and work 60 hours a week and be a good father. That is nearly impossible. So we know we start with that lie when we're pursuing that goal, right? Eventually, we have to tell it, we have to, in order to maintain that lie, we have to lie. In the case of working 60 hours and trying to be a good father, I may be lying to my boss, I may be lying to my wife, I may be lying to my son. In the case of my trying to be married and trying to have an affair, I'm going to be telling lies to both my wife and to the person I'm having the affair with, right? So our lies are attempt to control our reality. And our lies are based on a sort of hubris that we can, and that's the basis of Greek tragedy, is this idea the hero thinks they can control the reality like a god, but they can't. And so eventually the lies catch up to the person. And David Mamet has this saying where he says, each play begins with a lie, and when the lie is exposed, the play is over. So another way of thinking about this is the character at the beginning of the story may think of themselves in a certain way. But by the end, because of the lies they've told, because of the exposure of those lies on some level, they have to see themselves differently than they did. And part of seeing themselves differently is like, I didn't get away with it. On some level, I didn't get away with it. My lie was exposed, and I thought I had more control over my world than I did. I thought I was more powerful than I did. I thought I was a better person than I did, right? And of course, we can see examples of this right now in our political arena, which is which is filled with lies, right? But you can also see it in I tell my students to look at the basic plot of most sitcoms. The father will usually be a sort of blustery character, will say, I'm going to do this. And the wife challenges him, like, can you take care of the kids for a week, right? Without my help. And the father will say, yeah, of course I can. And then what will happen is a lie, and he'll get his sister or his mother to help him, and by the end, all the lies are exposed, right? It's just a basic way that fiction works, but it's a basic way that fiction works because it's a basic way our lives work.
There's a thing you say twice in the book, in slightly different forms at the beginning and the end. And here's it's on 226 is your second iteration of it. We start writing a book to become the person who can finish the book. What do you mean by this?
Well, I think when we're writing creative writing books, if the parameters we set out are properly ambitious and challenging, it generally means we can't finish it without changing something in ourselves. Sometimes we have to gain skills. Sometimes we have to admit failure. Sometimes we have to find deeper truths within the work. Sometimes it's revisiting something, some issue or some incident or some experience that we've thought we've understood, but haven't. Alexander Chee has a book of essays. It's titled something like How to Write an Autobiography in Essays, or something similar to that. But he talks about his own sense of that he kept on thinking he had mastered and understood the effects of an incident of sexual abuse in his childhood. And what he realized that even, that earlier in the earlier iteration of the novel, dealing with sexual abuse, he really hadn't examined the subject in its proper depth and complexity. And that was because he himself had been in denial about how much that experience had damaged and changed him. So I think oftentimes it's a psychological challenge we have to grow. And then there are obviously other challenges that, you write a book, sometimes you have to do research. Sometimes you have to go back and interview people or learn, suddenly learn a whole new topic and able to, you end up and suddenly you're dealing with the history of the Holocaust, or you're dealing with crime procedures. So you have to change in that way too, learning stuff. But I think the biggest challenge is for one to grow psychically.
In your book, you draw on a number of writers that many folks have been pulling away from, not reading their work, not teaching their work, because of recent reports that have come out, or allegations about how they have treated women. Do you see those larger conversations as having any implications or any bearing on your book?
Well, I think that, I don't know. My guess is yes. I've done some interviews, and this is actually the first time that's come up. But I think so, and I think the question becomes how we regard the work of writers who we believe have behaved badly. And I think each individual reader has to make up their own mind about that. Yeah. And so if somebody goes like, I don't want to read an essay about this writer, I don't know, there's nothing I can do. I can understand people feeling that way. But and then I would say it depends on the degree of how badly you think the writer has behaved. And then it's a portion of time, right? In 100 years, will people care about whether somebody did something? I don't know. I mean, they won't care in the way that now the people who are making these charges are alive and among us. So,
thank you. Do you have anything you want to ask me as a reader of your book?
Well, I'm curious to your reaction as a white writer and a writing teacher. What your reactions were to some of the issues and indeed challenges that I think the book lays down.
Well, my immediate reaction was just to be, I don't want to fanboy a little too much, but I was just in awe of how helpful it was, how good the writing was. I'm just really appreciate and I'm grateful for this book. So that's my first response, and I am recommending that all creative writers and all creative writing teachers read it. I hope it's assigned widely in MFA programs, and I am committed to finding ways to respond differently in those situations that you describe in the typical MFA program. You say you have a list of very rarelies at the end of that one essay. Very, very rarely will the white professor and other white students begin to examine the limitations of their own experience. Well, that's what I want to do then. I want to examine the limitations of my own experience. Very rarely will we begin to inquire what it means for us to be white. I want to do that. And to examine my own ignorance, and then you list some questions that we rarely ask. So I want to start asking those questions. That's I think part of my response. And then a lot of the book deals with the craft of telling stories. So I want to be able to apply that to tell better stories myself.
Yeah, it's curious to me that I will get students who've gotten MFAs from, prestigious like Ivy League programs, and they don't know the basics of how to tell a story. And I had one student this summer at Vona who said, yeah, whenever questions of narrative construction came up, they were sort of shoved to the side of my MFA program. And I went like, really? Like, why would you do that? You know, and there was sort of some of the implication was what we'd be concerned about. Somehow it's non-literary, but it's really like, no, Shakespeare uses these, the Greeks use these, Jane Austen uses these, Dickens used them, Tolstoy, you know, Toni Morrison, you know, in a complicated way, but she does use them. It's like, why wouldn't you learn them? And you know, when I was beginning to write fiction, I realized like I read through books like John Gardner's The Art of Fiction, which is a classic, but he really doesn't talk about how to construct a story. He talks about point of view, he talks about character, he talks about style, he talks about genre. But how, you know, but I found books on how to tell stories in screenplays and books on playwriting and books on myth. And I thought, why aren't we teaching these things in fiction writing or memoir? Because in memoir, you don't have to tell a story, but you can discover a story that you can tell. You know, as I tell students, it's like I could follow you around with a video cam for a year. That wouldn't be a story. I would have to edit it in such a way that creates a story. And the principles of those are no different than when some zoologist follows a polar bear family for a year and creates a story of the polar bear family. It's the same principles. The other thing I will say is that when I taught with a couple of people the writing on race workshop at Stone Coast, the white writers who went through it ended up being stronger, more courageous as writers, more willing to approach a more diverse range of subject matter, and certainly better able to write about American society, not today, which is actually incredibly diverse and whose diversity is only growing. So, you know, what I don't want white writers to think is like, you know, this is like you got to go back and take your medicine. You know, it really is like, if you're really looking, and your writing will get better, right? And part of what I meant by courageous is like, and I understand the reasons why white writers feel this, is like, well, if I enter in this area of race, what's going to happen? I might be critiqued, I might be called a racist, all these things might happen. But what happens then is if you begin to go in that, it becomes easier for you to deal with other subjects that you may feel are taboo, right? Other blocks that you may have, which may be more personal to you. Or you might see, like I had my student Helen Pepe, who was writing about growing up in rural Maine in a very, you know, large working class family. And what she realized was that her father was a post office worker. And she thought he was like, you know, administrator, or, you know, he didn't deliver mail, so he must have been more important than the people that deliver. And it wasn't until, and she had heard him described as an engineer, but then, you know, a maintenance engineer. And she was somewhere, and her family traveled through this area in DC where there were a lot of black people, and her parents freaked out. And during that trip, she saw a black janitor who had maintenance engineer on his, you know, his uniform. And she realized, oh, my dad's a janitor. So her realization of her dad's work was tied up with this idea that her parents were going, these are bad people, you don't want to be around them. And it shows how the white working class identity in this country has so been yoked in various different ways to racism. And it made her whole portrait of her family in her memoir much more complex. and her understanding of her parents much more complex, and her questioning of how she learned to think about herself as white. She had a language to talk about it, right? So it's not as if thinking like, oh, well, all of this is just going to put me in a one down position, right? Or all of this is just going to be painful. I think the more white writers deal with this subject, they'll realize like, oh, there's vast areas I haven't been writing about, I haven't been paying attention to. Oh, I could be braver than I am.
That makes a lot of sense to me. At the beginning, you describe, or in our conversation, that there's this argument about the nature of reality.
Yeah.
And if white writers would not think, oh, I got to lose that argument or win that argument or avoid that argument.
Yeah.
Instead, you just adopt a bigger, more complex, more developed version of reality. How could that not improve your writing? Well, David, thanks so much for talking with me. The last thing I just want to ask is if there's anything else that you want to say about your book or in general.
Well, thank you for having me, first of all. I really appreciate it, and really appreciate how closely you obviously have read the book. I will say that, you know, what the political climate we're in is in part due to the white realization that our demographics are changing, right? If you tell white people that they will no longer be a majority in 2040, what happens? Social scientists have investigated this. And what happens is white people react with a greater sense of threat to their own sense of identity, a greater fear of people of color, and they answer more conservatively, not only on racial issues, but on issues like climate change. So what this says is this question of what is whiteness? How do we define whiteness? How do we define America? And do we define America as something other than white? All of these issues are not going to become less important. They're not going to become less central to our society. You know, there were so many people who thought Obama's elected, we have black president, all our race problems are over. Okay, we understand now, no. And I think some people understand we're just beginning to deal with them at a different level. So I would say for both writers of color and white writers, this will be a central subject for America for years to come. And the more prepared you are to deal with this, the better you will be as a writer, but the better the country will be.
Amen. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, I'll cut this off.
So can I ask you?
Yeah. It's still recording. It's still running.
Still running. Okay, but you can cut it off, right?
Oh, okay, and then you'll ask me. All right.